The whole amphitheater inhaled as if the moon itself had stopped mid-breath when Caius Vale spat her name like a verdict. "Rejected," he said, and the syllable struck Arya like a thrown stone, hard, hot, and indisputable, so that she tasted iron and the sharp sting of humiliation in her mouth. Faces blurred into the wash of torchlight and fur, the chorus of the pack a single distant sound. Only her father's silhouette remained, a thing of carved bone and absolute command, unmoved as he unmade her in front of everyone she had ever known. The silence that followed was its own kind of punishment. Arya's knees gave, and the ground felt suddenly too small for the weight of the truth she'd been carrying all her life. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The torchlight painted her father's face in merciless gold, every ridge and scar a map of victories and the cost they demanded. He had raised the North March pack on the backbone of certainty, lineage, law, and the unassailable dominance of the Vale name. To be an Omega in the Vale was to be small by design. Soft hands that soothed, quiet mouths that kept secrets, obedient hearts that beat to the rhythm of the pack. Arya had been taught that choreography from infancy, how to lower her eyes when Alpha spoke, how to stitch the wounds of pride without complaint. But there had always been a fierceness beneath her ribs that hated stitches. She had learned to hide it between lessons, under the guise of dutifulness, the way a moon hides behind cloud and keeps shining anyway. The amphitheater smelled of smoke, damp leather, and the metallic tang of fear. The elders' faces were masks of ritualized concern. The betas exchanged looks that balanced sympathy with the hunger for maintaining order. Murmurs fluttered through the crowd like moths. Arya heard her own name as if through a thick wall. She could have explained, could have told them about the months spent at the border with her mother, about the scraped knees and nights the stars had kept her awake, about how her skin prickled to the call of the wild. But explanations were luxuries reserved for those with voice and place. The very rules that bound the pack had been authored by men whose hands never knew the cold of the wild beyond the border stones. A woman like her, half-blood, curious and unclaimed, slipped between their legalities like wind. An Omega must bend, Caius intoned, as if reciting scripture. An Omega who refuses is a danger. The word hung between them, a gauntlet he did not even pretend to lace with compassion. He unrolled the decree with practiced effortlessness. She would be shunned from the rights of the Vale, stripped of claim to protection, and ordered to leave the pack's lands by the next moonrise. It was not merely rejection, it was severance. It was sending someone without a map into a night known for gashing teeth. She felt, suddenly, that every breath before this had been an exile in miniature, each day a rehearsal for this humiliation. Her mouth opened to say something, anything, but the words refused her. Where her voice should have been, there was only the steady thrum of blood in her ears and the animal awareness that danger, now, had a name. She had not been allowed to choose. The pack had always chosen for her. Who she married, what she served, which shadows she slept under. Tonight, one choice made loudly by the man who called himself her father closed off every path she had imagined. Arya stumbled out of the amphitheater as the first of the night wolves took the moon like an oath. The cold bit through her cloak, but it was the weight on her chest, shredded pride, raw betrayal, that threatened to freeze her breath. She ran because staying would mean becoming a spectacle, a cautionary tale wrapped in Vale lore. Her boots found the path she had walked 100 times to the borderlands, but tonight the trees seemed foreign, branches like fingers poised to grab at her. The shrubs whispered of harsh places and harder truths. She did not know where she was going, only away, only farther from the crest of judgment and from the memory of her father's face when it had hardened into law. Moonlight caught her hair and turned it to silver, and then to shadow. Panic pressed at the back of her throat until it became a noise she could barely bear. On the ridge where the world fell away into scrub and stone, she saw movement, a ghost made solid, stepping out of the trees with a silence that belonged to wolves. He was older than the stories had implied. There was gray in the stubble at his jaw, a map of years written in the lines near his eyes. He moved like a predator and like a man accustomed to keeping his distance from both packs and promises. Rowan Cade, the exiled wolf. The packs whispered forever accused. Her childhood had been sung to her by elders who used him as a warning and a myth. The man who betrayed them, who was cast out to preserve sacred images. She had grown up with his name on the tip of every tongue, spoken with loathing, fear, and sometimes a grudging admiration for the way he could vanish into the borderlands and return only in rumor. He did not approach slowly. Instead, he closed the gap in 2 strides that were all predatory grace and careful calculation, as if measuring the risk of touch. He caught her before she collapsed, strong hands anchoring her in a world that had just been sundered. She expected him to be rough, punishing, harsh, as the pack had painted him, but his voice when it came was low and surprisingly gentle. "Arya," he said, as if that one syllable explained why he had returned to a scene of knives. There was no mockery in it, only something like recognition. He smelled of rain and smoke, and the wilderness beyond the Vale's laws. She clung to him like a person to a raft in a storm. "Stay away from me," she said, because that was the sanction memorized by anyone whose life had been lived under an alpha's boot. Her shock had not yet ripened into courage. She feared that to be seen with him would bring even worse scrutiny. If Caius could reject his own daughter in public, what would he do to punish her for sheltering an exiled wolf? Rowan's fingers tightened, not harshly, but like the pressure that tested whether branches would hold. "You ran," he observed, which was no solace, only a fact. His eyes, shade of steel with a fleck of tired gold, looked at her in a way that made her feel naked and mourned all at once. From the amphitheater. The world narrowed to his breath in her hair and the stubborn, impossible warmth of a hand on her back. She remembered the stories he had once been, a man with convictions that could have been mistaken for crimes, an exile who walked the border and held the wild like a secret. She remembered, too, the child who had traced his name into the dirt and asked why he had been cast out. No one had ever given her a real answer. Caius's verdict had been a kind of fog, impenetrable, preserved by silence. Rowan's exile had become a lesson in obedience, and the lesson had suffocated curiosity. Now, though, the exile's hands were steady, and there was a tenderness in them that made her breath hitch. "You shouldn't be here," she said, weakly, because the truth was as fragile as the thin scarf at her throat. She had fled the pack and found, in the space outside its rules, someone who once had been labeled a monster. The irony tasted like a promise. "Neither should you," Rowan answered, and in it was an unspoken accusation, that she had always been wronged, much as he had been. "Come, you'll freeze." He led her past the line where Vale fires petered out into the raw dark. The land changed as they moved. The trees thinned, revealing rock that glittered faintly under the moon. In a hollow shielded by stone and twisted pines, Rowan made a small fire and offered her the heat with a look that asked nothing and gave shelter anyway. It was a gesture so simple and so entirely without the authority of the Vale that she felt both ashamed and relieved to accept it. As she sat there wrapped in borrowed warmth, her knees an ache of shock, bits of memory threaded through her. Her mother's laugh like wind through white grass, the old wounds that had never been properly named. She had been half his child and half the others, and yet none of that had mattered to Caius when he needed a scapegoat to keep his image intact. She had lived looking for the place where the two halves could reconcile. Instead, tonight, her father had severed the very thing that made her whole. Rowan watched her quietly, as if cataloging fractures. "His father always chose simplicity," he said at last. Not cruelly, but with a sorrow that made something in her uncurl. "He likes the world in frames. Enemies, allies, rules. He hates the messy truths that require more than a decree." "Like you," Arya muttered, because to say his name out loud felt like a rebellion. "Like me," he agreed, "and like your mother." Her breath caught. Rowan had gone quiet then, as if the line between what was said and what was forbidden had been crossed. She hadn't known that Rowan had known anything about her mother beyond the sanctioned rumors. The stories had said Arya's mother had been taken by the border, lost, senselessly, a casualty of the Vale's expansion. But Rowan's eyes lit with a memory that contradicted the tidy story accepted by the Vale as much as a wildfire contradicts the horizon. "She wasn't lost," he said, the words low and certain. "She left." The revelation landed like a second stone. Arya stared at him, disbelief slicing the air. She left? The idea of her mother as an agent, someone who had chosen instead of being chosen, was a new and dangerous shape that didn't fit the pictures handed down at mealtimes and eulogies. Why? Rowan's mouth tightened. For a moment, the world narrowed to his profile against moonlight. He seemed older than the exile tales, carrying a history that had been chewed by wolves and preserved in silence. "Because she wasn't willing to be shaped into the Vale's story," he said. "Because she loved a truth your father couldn't afford." The fire popped, sending a silver flake of ash into the night. Arya felt as if a thread had been tugged free inside her chest, something that connected her to a past no one had told her about. If her mother had left by choice, then the narrative of victim and fate that had justified Caius's iron reign was a lie. Everything that had been used to justify Arya's place in the pack shifted, and the shift made the ground treacherous underfoot. In the rock shelter, between breaths and embers, a dilemma took shape as sharp and cold as the stone around them. To return to the Vale in the morning would be to submit, to accept the exile proffered as punishment, and live as a lesser thing beside a father who'd chosen spectacle over daughter. To stay, under the protection of the man her father had banished, was to walk into a different kind of danger. Scandal, reprisal, being labeled traitor by the only home she had ever known. Either path promised loss. The moon watched, indifferent and full, casting both options in silver that made the choices look sacred and terrible at once. The choice sat between them like a third body, breathing, claiming its own space. Go back and be small and safe? Go forward and possibly shunned? Arya found she could not name which fear was sharper. The shame of public rejection stung like open salt in a wound. But the thought of the Vale's silence, of being erased, nameless, a story parents told their children only to hush them before sleep, made her hands tremble in a way that felt like grief. Rowan watched her, the moon pulling hard lines on his face, making his jaw look carved from winter. "You can come with me," he offered, and the words surprised them both because they were so unspectacular, and therefore, in this moment, daring. He did not promise safety, only a place that had borne him when the pack's law had turned its back. "There are border camps that will give us shelter. I can move you. I can teach you what to hunt, how to listen to the land instead of to orders. Or you can go back and live under Caius' sanction." Arya's laugh was small and brittle. As if there's nothing to choose between a life of obedience and exile? No, he said, quick and soft. There's choosing. That's the difference. She stared at him, tasting the word like a fruit she had been denied. Choose. It was both permission and accusation. Choosing meant owning consequence. Choosing meant defying the man who had raised her, who had taught her that the pack's needs were always bigger than her own. For the first time, she realized how much of her had been built to reflect his will back at him, how many of her smiles had been calibrated to soothe him, how many of her dissents had been swallowed with the practiced politeness of a veiled daughter who knew how to keep a father satisfied. Why would you? She stopped. There were reasons, she supposed, that he would offer sanctuary. Guilt, a debt paid across a decade of silence, old loyalties rearranged. But Rowan's exile had been painted as more than scandal. It had been described as a moral failing so gross it had to be punished. To risk sheltering the Alpha's cast-off daughter was a reckless kindness. In the Veil's vocabulary, it was a provocation. Rowan's eyes flicked to hers, and in that flicker she read an answer she hadn't expected. "Because you are not what they say you are," he murmured, "and because you need someone to tell you you have choices besides the ones they've given you." That confession struck something in her that had been raw since infancy, the need to be seen for her whole self, not the version vetted by pack lore. She had always been taught to accept narratives. The Veil told their history like scripture, lineages trimmed of inconvenient facts, heroes made without blemish. Rowan's quiet claim that she wasn't their story made her feel for the first time like a person beyond the plot others had written for her. They ate in the hush of their small fire, of dry meat Rowan had kept between travels, and the last of Arya's rationed bread. The awkwardness of sharing food, an intimate act in the Veil where food was politics, sank into the soil between them and began to feed something tender. Rowan asked about trivial things that meant everything, whether she could skin a hare, whether she knew how to find north by moss, whether she dreamt in the old tongue. He was not trying to interrogate her. He wanted to assemble the parts of her life that did not belong to her father's edict. Arya surprised herself by answering. She told him about nights watching the horizon for lightning like some secret language, about her mother's hands, calloused and sure, brushing a needle across torn leather, humming a song Arya had not known how to hold on to. Rowan listened with that careful fierceness of someone who had learned to weigh people's small truths against the universal cruelty of exile. There was no condescension in his attention, only the rare warmth of a person who would keep silent oaths. When she told him about the amphitheater, about the way Caius had spoken her name, the wound reopened, raw and hot. Rowan's fingers found hers without ceremony, as if to anchor them both to reality. "He thinks of himself as the center of the world," he said. "If he can control your story, he controls the pack's story. You being here ruins that picture." "You make it sound like I'm a weapon," she said, but the word felt less like insult and more like truth. She had always been weaponized, used as an example of loyalty when useful, as a scapegoat when necessary. To be a weapon in someone's story was to have no agency. To be an instrument of image control stripped a person of humanity. "No," Rowan answered, "you are a person with a knife that can cut ropes." The image made her laugh, a short sound that was half disbelief, half relief. It was the first time anyone had framed her in a way that made her capable rather than ornamental. The warmth between them was practical at first, a place to rest, a hand to hold, but it threaded into something subtler, an almost imperceptible closeness that made the air between their fingers electric. When his thumb traced a line along the back of her hand, it felt like a map being redrawn with new boundaries. Their conversation turned slowly, inevitably, toward the unspoken history that had tethered them both to Caius. Rowan's exile, he admitted, had been messy and complicated. He told the barest shape of his past, A failed negotiation, a body that should have been protected but wasn't, a lie stitched into a decree to preserve an image. He did not exonerate himself with grandiose claims of innocence. Instead, he framed his story in small, human failures. Mistakes made under pressure, loyalty misread as treachery. The pack needed a narrative, he said. They needed a villain to explain away fear. I made it easy for them to point. But making it easy doesn't make it truth. Arya listened, the pieces hooking together into a picture that suggested her father had always traded people for power. The more Rowan spoke, the more she saw her life through a new lens, not as an inevitable path lit by tradition, but as a series of transactions where people were spent for the altar of control. "Why did your mother leave?" Rowan asked at one point, and Arya realized she had never actually asked her mother the question. Her upbringing had been a litany of hushed excuses, accidents, border violence, the cruelty of fate. But to hear Rowan suggest agency, that her mother had chosen, was like a key turned in a lock. She saw now that the true scandal wasn't her bloodline. It was the threat her mother's independence had posed to Caius' neat world. "I don't know," she said, the truth a small, bitter thing. She left a note. It said... Her voice broke off, unready to name what the note had said. Not a goodbye, but a set of instructions, a plea to Arya to keep a secret. She had never dared open the sentence in her memory. It said to trust the wind, she whispered finally, and the words tasted like salt and loss. Rowan's grip on her hand tightened as if to hold the wind steady. "Then let's make you a wind that chooses its direction," he said. Not some token chosen to reassure a pack. The moment stretched. The fire flickered, painting them in a softness that felt like a promise neither expected to make aloud. Arya's heart hammered with a new, dangerous hope. It was temptation, sweet, fierce, that offered her the possibility of a life not dictated by the veil. The danger in that temptation, though, was not merely political. To accept Rowan's shelter meant to accept him, his history, his exile, and the rumor that he carried like a shadow. The veil would not let such a union stand without retaliation. Equally, staying in the veil presented its own cruelty, a life of measured obedience and sanctioned suffering. She pictured waking each morning to the same carved face of her father, to the same rules that had never considered her heart's restless beating. She pictured the amphitheater again, faces lifted in ritual solidarity, as Caius spat a ruling she would have to live under. As the fire died to coals and the border stars wheeled overhead, they heard the first distant cry, the scouting wolves of the Vale, voices raised in pattern. Arya's body went rigid. Rowan's posture tightened in a way that spoke of old alarms. "They'll come looking," Arya said before she could stop herself. Rowan swallowed. "They will." The inevitability of it folded them into a hush that was both dread and clarity. They had both lived surrounded by the Vale's orbit. There were no surprises left in the world about how Caius would react to deviation. The Alpha's law was a living thing that needed reinforcements. Scouts, betas, the rumor mill. A single exile sheltered by an exiled man was precisely the kind of scandal that would spur the Vale to action, both to punish and to reassert the Alpha's image of control. Rowan rose, moving to the ring of shadow where the rock met tree. "We can move," he said. "There are caves east of the third ridge. I know a woman named Lysa there. She owes me a favor." Arya stood too, because staying seated felt suddenly like admission. Her legs were steady in a way that surprised her. The thought of refuge with an exile was still new enough to frighten her. But the alternative, returning to be shamed, felt colder than the night. She had been raised to fear scandal above all else, but there is a sharper fear still, the knowledge that your life was never meant to be yours. "I don't know how to survive out there," she admitted. "Not really." "You'll learn." He sounded almost certain. "You'll learn to hunt. You'll learn to trust your senses. You'll learn to name your own fears. And you'll learn who you are when the veil isn't defining you. They moved away from the fire then, shoulder to shoulder in a closeness that read more like alliance than romance, though the warmth that had settled between them hummed. The scouts' cries grew closer, ordered, controlled, and in them Arya heard the pump of her own blood. Her life had always been something to be managed. Now it seemed it might be something to be claimed. As they threaded through underbrush, Rowan's sleeve brushed her arm in a way that left a slow heat behind. Arya didn't step away. The touch was both an anchor and an invitation. She knew the rules her whole life. Keep your relationships tidy. Keep your feelings within the lines your father drew. Let nothing messy leak into the public eye. But she had been told to obey a narrative that had eaten her mother and poached her future. The scouts' voices cranked tight with the approaching search. Shapes moved in the periphery, men and women of the Vale, trained to see patterns and carry messages. One figure broke from the line, a familiar gait that her stomach knotted around. Mira, a beta who had held Arya's hand when she had been a child and stitched minor wounds in private. Her face was a study of conflict, duty pressing at the jaw, pity at the lip. She paused, then stepped forward. "Arya," Mira called, using the name that belonged to family. Her eyes flicked quickly to Rowan, and there was a flash. Judgment or fear? Arya couldn't tell. Before she hit it. "Alpha Caius demands you return. He says." "You will not take me," Arya said, the words coming from a place that felt stripped of hesitance, not after what he did in the amphitheater. Mira flinched as if struck, and Arya suddenly saw the woman she had known as a bridge between the Vale's cruelty and its compassion. "It's not that simple," Mira said. "He fears scandal. He will try to make an example." "Then I will be the example of another thing," Arya said, the decision settling into her like a jewel set into a crown. She felt the gravity of it. The understanding that choosing Rowan would not be a private act, but a public defiance. "I will not go back to be denied." Mira's face rearranged into something like sorrow. She stepped closer, the scout's stance still taut with loyalty, and reached out to touch Arya's cheek for the briefest of moments, a benediction or a farewell. "If you leave with him," she whispered, "there will be consequences. Caius will not stop until he wins. He is not a man who lets go." Arya met her gaze. In Mira's hand she felt the weight of the pack's judgment, the collective force that could remake lives with decree and rumor. But she had lived her life beneath that weight and had found it hollow at the core. She let the hand rest on her cheek and held Mira's eyes steady. "Then I would rather have consequences I choose," she said. Mira retreated, conflicted lines crinkling her forehead. The scouts gathered again, and the night's quiet was replaced by the logistical hum of a pack preparing to act. Arya turned to Rowan, and in his face she read the map of 1,000 exiles. Wary, tender, ready for danger, yet unwilling to give up the small warmth they had found. "We leave now," he said. She nodded. The decision thrummed in her bones like a drumbeat. They moved away from the Vale, from its amphitheater and its carved alpha, into a night that would demand everything from them: cunning, courage, and a willingness to be branded. Behind them, the Vale's torches drifted, fanning out like hands searching for what they would not let be lost without a fight. As the pack called and the border wind tightened, Arya felt the strange, frightening exhilaration of unclipping herself from a role prescribed before she had teeth to protest. The path ahead would be hard, full of hunger and doubt, of old loyalties turned into arrows aimed at their backs. But for the first time, the fear of being small had been outweighed by the possibility of being whole. They slipped into the fringe of the borderlands, Rowan leading with a surety born of years in exile, Arya following with new resolve. Around them, the world held its breath. Ahead, the border breathed back, wild and indifferent. And in the space between the veil and the wild, a connection deepened, tentative, charged, something that might one day become love, or ruin, or both. For now, it was simply breath synchronized, footsteps matched, and the fierce, fragile promise that two damaged people could risk everything by choosing one another. The first crack of thunder was not from the sky, but from the veil itself, a ripple of sound like armor struck in anger, as word moved faster than runners. Somewhere behind the black band of trees, torches flared, and the amphitheater's ordered chorus turned to a low, animal groan. Arya felt it in her teeth, in the tiny, involuntary movement of her shoulders. The veil did not forgive or forget. They pursued. That truth rearranged the night into a geometry of threat. Not if they would come, but how many, and whether any of the fragile alliances around the border would hold. Rowan's jaw clenched. He had expected the Veil's reaction, expected the hunt that followed any scandal, but he had not expected how personal their hatred would become. The first scouts slid from the dark like shadows made solid, faces obscured by hoods and wolf-scented fur. They moved with the confidence of people used to having the law behind them. They were not simply searching for two runaways. They had come to reclaim a narrative, to perform obedience in public. "They will try to draw us into a skirmish," Rowan said, voice low, the map of the land spelled into it by habit. "They will test whether the border camps will shelter us. If they find leverage, someone to barter, they will use it." Arya's hand found his sleeve and gripped there like an anchor. "And if they don't find leverage?" He looked at her, thicker than moonlight, harder than the jokes of exile. And for a moment she couldn't read him. "Then they will invent it." A figure detached from the scouts and stepped into the fringe where Rowan and Arya crouched beneath a bent pine. The torchlight caught the lines of her face. Mira. The beta's face was a landscape of fatigue and quiet conflict. Behind her, a handful of Veil wolves waited like a scored chorus, obedient to her stance and, by extension, to the alpha she served. "Alpha Caius demands your surrender," Mira said, and her voice tried to present the weight of duty without the cruelty laying behind it. "Return with us. It isn't too late to come home." Her tone landed like a blade. Arya's chest convulsed. Home was the amphitheater where her father had unmade her. Home was the place that had made loyalty into armor and people into props. Nothing about that home felt like mercy. "I will not," Arya answered, before she had permission to say anything. The words were hotter than she expected. They surprised her with their insistence. Mira sucked in a breath, and for a single second, Arya saw the beta as someone who had once stitched cuts at her knees while whispering promises that were half comfort and half caution. "They will come for you," Mira said. "If you stay, if you force this, Caius will bring the full pack. There will be blood." "He brought me shame," Arya said. "The confession came ragged but true. He banished my mother with lies." Mira blinked. The movement, small, almost casual, unsettled Arya. Doubt ran a cold thread through her chest. Had Mira told them? Had the woman who had once been kind to her sold her to save some other thing? "Arya, please," Mira murmured. "There are other ways." Other ways. The phrase was a knife that split. Arya had always been told the world offered only other ways, ways that did not include her as a full human being. She had been trained to sacrifice herself in service to stability. Now, Mira's hesitation read like betrayal. The sudden crack of a branch at the fringe answered them. Mora, a border woman with a scarred cheek who had made shelter with Rowan in winter, crashed through with two others. Her eyes blazed like coals. "You let them talk to you?" she demanded. "We are not a herd that can be frightened into giving up fledglings." Mira flinched under Mora's look. There was real fear in her face now, compounded with guilt. Only Alpha Caius believes if he can bring you back. Believes because he wants to, Rowan snarled, the animal in him rising, the border wolf who had eaten silence for a decade and grown teeth from it. He doesn't believe in truth, he believes in appearances. Mira's fingers went white on the reins of whatever excuse she had come with. You don't understand what he's capable of, she whispered, almost pleading. If he thinks you are sheltering with exile wolves, he will drag the Veil into the borderlands. He will burn camps to the ground to prove a point. Arya heard the edges of her resolve begin to fray. Burning camps meant families dead, children orphaned, rumors twisted into fuel for vendettas that would stretch for generations. Rowan watched her carefully, his lips pressed into a line of worry. They were not merely running for themselves. Their choice had implications deep as roots. Then let him prove it, Arya said, more fiercely than she felt. Let him burn. This is not about making him look weak. This is about truth. Mira's face collapsed then into an expression Arya had never seen before. It was remade of fatigue and the terror of being wrong. She looked to Rowan. You knew him, she said, voice cracking. You were with them back then. You helped build the peace before the accusation. Why would you come back now to— Rowan's mouth tightened. Because a child is in his amphitheater tonight, and she has been unmade, he answered. The word child landed like a hand on an ancient wound. Because the stories they told about me, some truth, some lie, cost people their rights, their names. I cannot watch them carve someone else to prop up a throne. Mira's eyes dove inward, a storm brewing in her. She stepped forward, so close the torchlight etched the planes of her face. Then you should have said something when you were gone, she accused. The lines of sense and accusation nodded. You should have come forward when he decided you were the scapegoat. You left us to manage the fallout. Rowan's face sheened with unreadable emotion. For a fraction of a heartbeat, Arya thought she could see a different story. One where Rowan had been able to stand before Caius, declare the truth, and be believed. Instead, he had walked into exile, and the Veil's narrative had hardened into law. I tried, he said, finally. They would not hear. Who? A low voice asked from beneath a cluster of pines. A man stepped forward. Grend, a Veil veteran who had fought beside Caius in sundry border skirmishes. He carried the arrogance of a man used to having truth bend to the Alpha's will. You came back for sedition, and you will be judged. Gren's presence turned the conversation violent and public. The scouts behind Mira shifted, the crowd sound of their gathered resolve like a drumbeat. Mora, Mira, and the border folks stiffened. The weight of tradition, of armor and song and sacrifice lowered like a net designed to trap them. Stop, Arya said, interrupting the escalation. This is our land, whether they have a name carved on it or not. They send their law into our homes, we will answer it on our terms. Gren's eyes glinted. You speak like a leader, he sneered. A traitor in Veil's lands cannot be a leader. The world around Arya tightened. She had thought of leadership as a place she had never deserved, a carved role reserved for alphas who remembered to be ruthless. Now the accusation framed her as a kind of power she had never wanted and possibly never could wield. The idea made her dizzy, a sharp, terrible vertigo of responsibility. Mira made a decision then, visible as a shudder in her shoulders. She drew a breath that smelled of pine and fear. Alpha Caius needs proof of your contamination, she said, more to herself than to them. He needs a public demonstration to bind the pack. She turned to Grend. There is a seal he cannot ignore. Rowan Cade's signature upon a treaty, a ledger entry. If we can produce evidence of his dealings with border camps, proof he consorted. Proof, Gren snorted. We already have proof. The night of the negotiation, he left the table. The envoy died. Caius declared it treachery. History wrote him guilty. That will stand. Mira's shoulders tensed in shame. Caius will not be satisfied with stories anymore. The amphitheater will want a spectacle. Arya's heart stuttered. Spectacle. She had been made a spectacle once in the amphitheater, lobbed like a pebble for the pack's moral amusement. The thought of being subjected to that show again, this time as a traitor who harbored the enemy, set her teeth on edge. Her eyes flashed to Rowan. He was watching her like a man measuring how best to protect a faltering flame. You cannot bargain with a man who makes war of appearance, Rowan said. If they think they can use you to clean his hands, they will. We must move before they can marshal the amphitheater. Move? Mira's voice was brittle with an attempt at reason. Where will you go that Caius will not burn? You will be hunted as long as you draw breath. Arya felt it then. The raw, bleeding conviction that living under the amphitheater's law was its own slow immolation. Mira's face, once tender and warm, had become the face of a pack broken between duty and pity. You won't join them if they come for me? Arya asked, voice small but blazing. Mira's eyes went wet with an internal war. She took a step back, as if surrendering to a truth she had concealed under layers of technique and survival. She started, then stopped. The sentence died on her lips. In its place came the tremor of choice. She was not the Alpha. She had never wanted to be. She had been a bridge, but bridges could be burned if too many feet trod over them. The forest answered with a scraping of leather. The veil had moved closer. Their scout voices sharpened into a coordinated chorus, the reality of their approach fracturing the knight's fragile bargain. In the movement, Mora spat on the ground. If they come to burn the camps, we'll fight, she said simply. We will not hand over children to make men feel safe. Grand barked orders then. The Alpha's law mimicked in his voice, a man pleased at the prospect of violence. Encircle, he said. Cut off their retreat. We will make this an end. In the sudden, coordinated motion of the veil, cracks opened not only in the borderland, but within Arya's fragile band. Mira paused as if time itself had gotten heavier. The beta, who had once kissed Arya's forehead at night, was now standing with a pack's weight on her shoulders, her choices like talons. To stay was to side with the border and risk the veil's wrath. To go was to be branded a traitor's helper. Her whisper to Arya was the sound of a woman finally naming her fear. If you stay with him, I cannot protect you from what my Alpha will do. If you leave with him, I cannot protect you from what the pack will call you. Arya felt betrayal erupting like a blind wound. The woman who had sutured her scrapes now offered counsel shaped by fear of a greater beast. Rage and grief twisted in her like twin vines. Then protect me by keeping silent, Arya said, voice raw. Do not take the side that will make me a weapon. Mira looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Not the obedient Omega she had stitched, but a person with teeth. You demand I choose between my pack and my compassion, she said. Arya, you cannot. I can, Arya snapped, because I am tired of being asked to bow so others can sleep easier. Mira's shoulders sagged, and in that surrender, something unstitched between them. A small sound escaped her, half apology, half admission, and then she turned away. She walked back toward Grend and the Vale lines, the action a public realignment. The scouts closed like a fist. Arya, Rowan said, his voice small, the exiled wolf who had known a lifetime of being turned away, "You have to move, now." Behind them, the Veil's torches threw long, accusing shadows. The border folk scrambled, the readiness of those who had lived close to hunger and storm surfacing as something fierce and purposeful. Mora's hand brushed Arya's arm in a quick, fierce clasp. No blessing, no betrayal, just the solidarity of someone prepared to fight. And in that moment, the fractures revealed themselves for what they were. Not merely political lines drawn across land, but the deeper tearing of trust. Mira had once been a pillar. Now she was a hinge swung by fear. Others in their ring, some steadfast, some wavering, turned their faces like weather vanes. Arya had chosen a course that would make her a lightning rod. People she loved would be hurt because of it. Rowan, bound by silence and scars, had offered shelter and then withheld the truth that might have shaped her choice differently. The knowledge that their love, if it could ever be named that, would be a public act of rebellion sat between them like a wound that needed tending. They fled through bracken and forked paths, pursued not only by the Veil, but by the knowledge that some people would not forgive them for choosing themselves. The sky above was a hard, indifferent map of stars. Below, on the ground, feet slipped and hands found one another. The world they ran into was jagged and real, full of risk and raw possibility. Behind them, the amphitheater's law uncoiled like a snake, ready to strike. Rowan ran with the fury of someone who had been blamed for too much and forgiven by none. But beneath his anger was something else, a tender, terrifying protectiveness he had not admitted before. Arya felt it in the way his hand closed over hers, in the way his shoulder steadied her after a fall. She realized then that secrets had been kept on both sides, Rowan's silence, Caius's lies, Mira's reluctant betrayal, and that any future would have to be built on truth painfully revealed and scars openly tended. As the Veil's shouts grew nearer and torches painted the trees like columns of accusation, Arya's chest burned with a new resolve. Whatever fractures yawned between hearts and histories, she would not be made into another cautionary story. The danger ahead would be real, the cost unknown. Yet every step away from the amphitheater was an act of claiming, of declaring she would not be defined by shame. They crossed a ridge, and the valley beyond opened like a throat. Into its shadow they dropped, fugitives, loved and hunted, each fracture of their past a reason and a risk. The night swallowed them. Behind, the Veil's torches became a constellation of inevitability. Ahead, the border breathed, indifferent and possible. In the dark, Arya finally let herself ask the question she had kept at the edges of thought for too long. If the truth of her mother and the truth of Rowan's exile could unravel the Veil's decrees, what else might truth do? And at whose cost would that unraveling come? The answer was not yet hers to know. But as Rowan pulled her deeper into the border's embrace, hands sure, breath ragged, they ran toward a reckoning the amphitheater had no jurisdiction over. The slow, sharp reclamation of lives that had been miswritten by men who believed the world was theirs to order. They came like a tide. The Veil scouts poured into the hollow in disciplined waves, torches flaring like a makeshift sun, their voices welded to orders that left no room for mercy. The border folk answered with a panic-born formation. Bolts knocked, makeshift spears raised. But what met the first clash was not a grand battle so much as the cruel arithmetic of consequences. Arya watched the first man fall with too familiar helplessness, a young border scout she had seen run water for the wounded in other winters. His life was small and sudden, and finally paid a price she had not authorized. Rowan moved through the chaos like a shadow remade into steel. He fought as if each strike repaid a decade of silence. Defensive, precise, the exile's cunning turned into a thing of protection. Arya wanted to run to him, to wrap her limbs around his chest and stop the violence with nothing more than the insistence of her heartbeat. But the Veil needed spectacle. They wanted a scene where cruelty could be dressed as righteousness. If she showed herself to them as his partner, they would use that to carve deeper. A flare of torchlight hit a line of border women, and for a breath, Rowan's guard faltered. In that falter, a Veil blade found purchase along his side. He grunted, half-turned, and in the motion, he pushed Arya behind him in the same heartbeat. An old, terrible courtesy. Take the blow meant for the softer one. The air filled with the wet, metallic smell of injury, and Rowan's breath came shallow. "Rowan!" Arya's scream ripped through the night, raw with accusation and fear. She lunged, shoved past men whose faces were masks of duty, and found him sliding to one knee, blood dark as spilled winter across his tunic. He looked up at her with a ferocity made of surrender. There was no theatrical stoicism in his eyes, only the private thing he had kept for himself, a person who would give himself to save another. The sight should have tethered her. Instead, it untied her up from all the cords she trusted: safety, obedience, the small mercies of living small. In the pain that showed like an open map on Rowan's face, she saw the cost of silence, the currency of exile paid in someone else's blood. The world pulled taut around that single, terrible fact. "Stay," he rasped, but his voice was softer than the demand, a pleading built of the same kindness that had sheltered her by the fire. "Get to the trees. Live if you can." "No," she said, and it was both answer and revolt. She shoved a hand into his coat, dabbing at the wound, though she had no skill, doing something both useless and essential. "They will not take you like this." He smiled then, small, incredulous, because she had refused the calculus of sacrifice offered to her by men who kept tally of bodies. "You cannot carry this as penance for my mistakes." "I carry nothing but myself," she answered, "and I choose who I carry with me." The Veil advanced, their lines tightening like a noose. Grend barked a command that was less military and more ritual. "Bring them in." It was an order dressed in legality, and within it the bones of cruelty that had formed Caius Veil's reign. The scouts closed, the border folk braced. Arya dragged Rowan to the nearest boulder and pressed her body over his, an act that was at once defiant and intimate. The brazenness of their proximity became a public argument. If the Veil wanted to perform their law, they would have to cut through a real flesh-and-blood refusal. She stood with her back to the advancing line like a shield that refused to be silent. "Rowan Cade," Grend called, voice bellowing with relish. "By the authority of Alpha Caius Veil, you are charged with treachery, murder, and sedition. Surrender now and be judged." A slow silence pooled. All the border folk held their breath as if sound could weigh the moment. Arya felt every heartbeat in the crowd slam against her ribs. Anger, hunger, fear, the rawness of people watching their lives potentially be erased for the sake of an image. Rowan coughed, then laughed in a way that was small and bitter. "You want my surrender?" he said, voice steady though blood trembled on his lips. "Take it, but not for your narrative." He turned his wounded face to the amphitheater's line, to the torches that had lit his exile. "You want a story tidy enough to sleep by. I'll give you a story you can't refuse." He pushed himself up with a groan and stepped, half carried by Arya's hands, into the torchlight. Arya wanted to grab him, to refuse this martyrdom. Instead, she realized that Rowan's motion was not a surrender so much as a jostle of the world's balance. He had not come back to hide. He had come back to name things aloud. In the raw, ragged edge of the amphitheater's attention, truth had power not because it was loud, but because it was unignorable. "I will not let you take him," Arya said before she could think her way into silence. She pulled free a scrap of paper she had kept secret, a note from her mother, folded so many times the edges were soft. It had been a relic of anger and instruction, the smallest accusation against a man who had bred obedience into his people. With a trembling hand, she flung it into the circle where judges and soldiers stood. Caius's head snapped toward the small flying scrap as if a snake had struck his ear. In his expression, something older thudded, the fragility of a man whose empire relied on untarnished history. He reflexively reached to stop the paper, to snatch the narrative back into his hands. But the note fluttered past Grend and landed at Caius' feet, where the torchlight revealed its ink. Arya stepped forward then, the surge of adrenaline making her voice new and clear. She began to speak, not a plea, not a whisper of shame, but a naming. She read the lines of her mother's handwriting aloud, letting each syllable detonate against the amphitheater's order. That her mother had left, that she had refused alliance with the Veil, that she had chosen the border and chosen truth over being a prop. Rowan, bleeding and leaning on her shoulder, watched the Alpha's face change as if weather were revealing rock beneath skin. "It says," Arya read, "that truth is her only heir." The amphitheater shuddered as if the word truth were a wind. Men muttered. Mira's face, in the torchlight, was a torn map of allegiance. Somewhere in the ranks a child began to cry, the sound a human counterpoint to the political machinery churning like a mill. Rowan used the confusion. He steadied himself, wrenched his voice into a pitch of command that had nothing to do with exile and everything with ownership. "I did not kill the envoy," he said, voice cutting. "I left the table because I saw what your deals did to people. You hid a death in rhetoric and turned me into a scapegoat. I will show you the ledger if you bring me forward to be heard." Caius' eyes, for a moment, were animal, blind pride warring with the fear of a man whose stage was cracking. "You will never speak at my amphitheater," he spat. "You are exiled." "I will speak anywhere it matters," Rowan answered. He looked at Arya then, and the gaze was a whole promise. "And if it costs me everything," he said, "I will still speak." For a heartbeat, the world narrowed only to them, the woman who had been made small and the man who had been made a lesson. Then Rowan did something so raw it could have been foolish. He lifted his bloodied hand, pressed it to Arya's forehead, and said, quiet enough for no one but her, "Claim me, not as property, but as partnership. Tell them I belong to no name but my own, and to you." Arya's throat closed. The sacrifice, the pain, the wound, all of it was a consecration. To claim him would be to risk the Veil's full wrath. To remain silent would be to let his injury mean nothing. She stepped forward, every breath a rebellion. "This is the man who saved me," she said, loud enough to shatter pretense. "This is the man I choose." The sentence landed like a key. In that naming, something shifted. Not instant peace, not the end of war, but a rearrangement of claim. Men who had thought of Arya as a token now watched her as a person with authority to speak for herself. The amphitheater that had unmade her had to reckon with a daughter who refused erasure, and a wounded exile who refused to be erased alone. Caius's face contorted, anger, disbelief, and then the slow dawning of calculation. He could punish them, burn the border to cinders, make examples until no one dared dissent. Or he could pivot, find a way to save face by allowing truth to be framed as mercy. His empire had always been built on editing facts until they fit. Grend moved forward with a bellow, ready to enforce law. But even he hesitated, as if the air itself had become unstable. Rumors, once whispered, have weight when spoken into light. Rowan's ledger, the mother's note,
Arya's naming, each item piled like kindling under the amphitheater's brittle sense of inevitability. And in the flare of torchlight and the hush that followed, Arya realized the real sacrifice had not been Rowan's blood alone. It was the moment where two people refused to be private in their love, choosing instead to make it unignorable. That choice would be punished or heralded. History would take its hand.
But for the first time since Caius had spat her name, she felt the dangerous, radiant clarity of being fully claimed. Rowan's breath hitched. He pressed his forehead to hers, blood leaving a dark map that she would not scrub clean because it told the truth of what had been done. "Go on," he murmured. "Say what must be said." So she did. She told the amphitheater about betrayals and bargains, and about a mother who had chosen herself instead of being cast as a sacrifice. She told of a ledger that would prove deals hidden in the dark. She told a story of a man who had been made a villain to protect an image, and of a pack that could either keep its history clean and dead, or make room for messy human truth. When she finished, silence held like a blade waiting to fall. The choice belonged to Caius then, to meet the truth and be diminished by it, or to strike and risk.